Inside Barry's and Elsin's silent breakup, what really happened? There was no dramatic fight caught on camera. No explosive interview. No tearful confession on a talk show couch. Just two people who had built something real, something millions watched and rooted for, and then one day the silence between them became permanent. Barry's and Elsin. For a long stretch of time, those two names felt inseparable. On screen, they were magnetic. Off-screen, the chemistry seemed just as undeniable. Fans followed every glance, every photo, every carefully worded interview. And then, without warning, the story just stopped. No explanation. No closure. Just a quiet, coordinated disappearance from each other's lives. So, what actually happened? Because here's the thing. When two public figures end a relationship loudly, the world gets an answer, even if it is a messy one. But when it ends in silence, the silence itself becomes the story. And the silence between Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu has been saying something for a long time. The question is whether anyone has been listening closely enough. To understand where this story ends, you have to understand where it began. And it did not begin the way most celebrity relationships do, with a red carpet sighting or a tabloid tip. It began in a place that felt almost too perfect to be real. Barış Arduç had already established himself as one of Turkish television's most compelling young actors. He had the kind of presence that cameras love and audiences chase. Audiences knew him, trusted him on screen, wanted to see what he would do next. But off-screen, he was notoriously private. That quietness was part of his identity. Elçin Sangu brought something different to the table. She was charismatic in a way that felt effortless. Her career had a momentum all its own. She had built a following that admired not just her work but her, the real person behind the roles. She posted with intention, spoke openly about things that mattered to her, and carried herself with a kind of grounded confidence that is genuinely rare in the entertainment industry. When they were cast together, the professional connection was obvious. But what nobody could have predicted was how quickly the line between the fictional world and reality would begin to blur. There is a phenomenon that actors talk about, rarely in public, but honestly in quieter conversations. When you spend months inhabiting an emotional relationship on screen, when you go through the scripted highs and heartbreaks of a character who loves someone, the boundaries of real feeling can shift without you even noticing. It is not a scandal. It is not a weakness. It is just the nature of deep, repeated emotional immersion. And from everything that filtered through in interviews and observations at the time, that appears to be part of what happened with Barış and Elçin. Neither of them announced the relationship officially in a traditional sense. But the signs were everywhere for those paying attention. The way interviews changed in tone. The way fan accounts, always the first to notice these things, started compiling evidence with the obsessive focus of detectives. The way the two of them talked about each other. There was warmth there that scripts cannot manufacture. For a while, it was one of those relationships that felt genuinely good. Not in a performative celebrity way. Not in a way that was built for public consumption. There was a realness to it that made fans protective rather than intrusive. People were not just watching. They were quietly rooting. And that is precisely what makes what came next so strange. The unraveling, if that is even the right word, did not happen all at once. There was no single moment. No one scene that explained everything. Instead, there was a gradual shift, small at first, then impossible to ignore. The shared appearances became less frequent. The energy in joint interviews changed. Subtle, if you were not paying attention. Glaring, if you were. Here is something worth understanding about how public figures navigate the end of private relationships. Most of them do not get the luxury of falling apart quietly. Every absence becomes evidence. Every cryptic post gets screenshot and analyzed. Every smile that does not quite reach the eyes is studied in slow motion. The pressure to appear composed while privately processing something as destabilizing as a breakup is enormous. And both Barış and Elçin are people who seem to take their public image seriously, not in a vanity sense, but in a professional and personal dignity sense. They did not want a spectacle. So they did what emotionally intelligent people often do. They chose silence over explanation. But silence, as anyone who has ever been on the receiving end of it knows, rarely feels like nothing. Silence is a communication all its own. Fan communities notice the shift months before any official word. That is not gossip. That is the reality of what happens when millions of people invest genuine emotional energy into public figures. They become extraordinarily attuned to the smallest details. And the details were adding up. Separate events. Separate posts. A conspicuous lack of acknowledgement that would have been unremarkable between strangers, but felt significant between two people who had, by all appearances, been deeply intertwined. Then came what some fans describe as the moment that made it undeniable. It was not a statement. It was not a confrontation. It was simply the accumulation of enough small absences that the picture became impossible to misread. They were no longer part of each other's stories. And both of them seemed to have made that decision deliberately and, from the outside, with a mutual respect that is honestly more rare than it should be. This is where speculation begins to mix with what can actually be confirmed, and it is important to be clear about that distinction. Nobody outside their immediate circle actually knows what caused the breakup. There are theories, naturally. There always are. Some point to the pressures of two high-profile careers pulling in separate directions. When both people in a relationship are at a stage where their professional lives demand enormous focus, the logistics of maintaining intimacy become genuinely difficult. Schedules, locations, the exhausting business of being publicly present while privately keeping something sacred. It is not a dramatic reason, but it is a real one. Others have speculated about the emotional toll of playing romantic roles repeatedly while navigating a real romantic relationship. There is something psychologically complex about inhabiting love as a performance while also trying to live it authentically. Some couples find that kind of shared creative experience brings them closer. Others find that it complicates the already difficult work of genuine partnership in ways that are hard to articulate, let alone resolve. None of that is confirmed. None of it should be presented as fact. But it is the honest range of what people who have followed this story have pieced together from publicly available information, from interviews, from body language, from the slow drift of two social media presences that once overlapped and gradually stopped. What is clear is that both Barış and Elçin have continued to move forward with their lives and their careers in ways that suggest a level of emotional processing that did not happen overnight. They did not rush into public narratives that would have made the split feel messier than it apparently was. They gave themselves and each other the room to figure out who they were on the other side of something significant. Barış, in the period following the breakup, threw himself into his work with an intensity that many observers noted. There is a pattern that shows up repeatedly among actors who are dealing with private emotional weight. The work becomes a container for feelings that have nowhere else to go. The camera does not ask you how you are doing. The character does not require you to explain yourself. There is a relief in that, even if it is temporary. Elçin's path looked different. She remained publicly present, but there was a shift in the kinds of things she spoke about, the causes she gave her energy to, the way she framed her own story. She had always been thoughtful in her public communication. After the breakup, that thoughtfulness seemed to deepen. Like someone who had gone through something that changed their perspective in ways they were still integrating. Neither of them, at any point, spoke about the relationship or its end in any detail that reached the public. There were no veiled jabs. No cryptic posts that invited decoding. No tell-all interviews with the kind of strategic vulnerability that turns heartbreak into press. This is actually extraordinary when you consider the media environment both of them operate in. One where personal pain is routinely commodified and where public figures are often under enormous pressure to provide a narrative that satisfies audiences who feel owed one. They refuse to do that. And whatever else one might say about how the relationship ended, that refusal deserves acknowledgement. There is something worth sitting with here. We live in an era where the architecture of celebrity is built around access. Around the idea that proximity to a public figure's genuine life is something audiences are entitled to, that if someone has invited you into their professional world, you are somehow owed an invitation into their private one as well. Barış and Elçin, in how they handled this, quietly pushed back against that assumption. They reminded anyone paying attention that the fact that people are watching does not mean people are owed an explanation. That said, the curiosity itself is not irrational. Fans who followed this story were not simply nosy. They had spent real time and real emotional energy on these two people. They had invested in something. When that something quietly disappeared, the confusion and the need for closure were genuine. It is worth taking that seriously rather than dismissing it. The real emotional weight of this story is not the breakup itself. Relationships end. Even beautiful ones end. That is not the tragedy. The tragedy, if there is one, is in what it asks of both the people involved and the people watching. It asks everyone to live with ambiguity, to accept an ending that does not come with the kind of neat explanation that would allow everyone to exhale and move on. And ambiguity is hard. We are wired to seek patterns, to want causes and effects, to need stories to close properly. A breakup with no villain, no explosive confrontation, no clearly defined moment of rupture is somehow harder to process than one that burns everything down visibly. There is no one to be angry at, no event to point to, just a gradual, painful recognition that something that was real no longer exists. In the months and years that followed, both careers continued. Both lives continued. That continuation carries its own quiet kind of meaning. People who shared something significant and then parted ways can still build good lives. They can still do meaningful work, connect with new people, evolve into versions of themselves that would not have been possible without going through the difficult passage of what they went through. That is not a consolation prize. That is just the actual shape of how humans grow. There are fans who still hold on to the hope that the story is not finished. That two people who had that kind of chemistry do not simply stop mattering to each other forever. That somewhere down the line, circumstances change, perspectives shift, and something that was paused might restart. That hope is human and understandable. But it is also worth honoring these two people enough to take their choices seriously. They made a decision. They have lived with it. They deserve to have that respected rather than endlessly second-guessed. What this story ultimately leaves you with is not a scandal, not a villain, not a satisfying conclusion that ties everything together neatly. What it leaves you with is a portrait of two genuinely talented, emotionally intelligent people who built something real, navigated the extraordinary pressures of doing so in public, and chose to protect the dignity of what they had by refusing to let it become a spectacle when it ended. In an industry and a media landscape where spectacle is the default, where heartbreak is content and personal pain is a publicity opportunity, that choice is actually rare. It does not give audiences what they thought they wanted, but it might give something more valuable. A reminder that some things are worth keeping private, that not everything beautiful needs to be witnessed to be real, and that the end of a love story is still, at its core, a private human experience, even when it happens between two people the whole world is watching. Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu were something. For a time, they were something significant. And then, quietly, that chapter closed. Not with a dramatic final scene. Not with a speech that wrapped everything up with meaning. Just with two people choosing to move forward, separately, and carrying whatever they learned from each other into whatever comes next. That is not a small thing, even if it is a quiet one. What do you think? Let us know in the comments.